Good evening, everyone. This is Brown at Eye of Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about the Ghost Rider and Werewolf by Night team-up story, Return of the Braineaters. This particular story came out in 1992, and it took place in issues 107 through 112 of Marvel Comics Presents. And as you can probably guess from the title, Return of the Braineaters is in fact a sequel story. More specifically, it's a sequel to the Werewolf by Night story, Children of the Beast, which also took place in Marvel Comics Presents several issues ago. And I honestly thought that Children of the Beast was a wonderful introduction to the character of Werewolf by Night, and it also did a nice job of taking readers through the darker corners of the Marvel Universe. And as a work of horror, it was a very well done story. And so Return of the Braineaters, while it's not quite as good as Children of the Beast, I thought it was a solid sequel that stood on its own and worked on its own merits. And I'll definitely be putting the link to my review for Children of the Beast in the description below, so that way, if you're not able to, read the story yourself, you can at least, get my take on it. But this particular story, Return of the Braineaters, it came out at a point in time where Ghost Rider was a very popular character as far as readership goes throughout the Marvel Universe. And he had gotten to a point where he was promoted to, say, a flagship character alongside Wolverine for the book Marvel Comics Presents. And the character's regular writer for the regular book, Howard Mackie, had written a significant portion of the Ghost Rider stories in Marvel Comics Presents up to this point. But beginning with 107, or issue 107, other writers would come in and take a shot at handling Ghost Rider, and they would have him team up with other characters. And so with this particular story, you had the writer Chris Cooper come in and handle things. And I'm not too familiar with Chris Cooper's work, but I do know that he was the writer for the book Darkhold, Pages of the Book of Sins, which was one of the more popular books and better remembered books from the Midnight Sun storyline, in which the Ghost Rider book was a big part of. And so the fact that you had a horror, you had the writer of a horror comic, that was soon to come, doing a horror story with both Ghost Rider and Werewolf by Night, I thought was an interesting little touch. But also I thought he did a good job of handling both characters. And while there are some narrative choices I thought could have been done better on his part, I thought that overall he had a solid handling of how to write both Jack Russell and Danny Ketch. And their initial dust up with one another, while granted it was a case of mistaken identity, it at least made sense in context of the story. And also like how at the end of the story, the two of them end up bonding and becoming friends over the fact that both of them have demons literally that they must contend with. And so I also liked the artwork by the penciler John Stanisci. I hope I'm saying his name right, but his artwork is something that took some getting used to. But considering the dark tone of the story, and and it was a horror story for sure, I thought the artwork worked for the story. And the Braineaters looked very terrifying. And at times, in terms of, say, the tone of the story, it felt like that Chris Cooper was taking some of the, I guess you could say, sophisticated horror of something from, say, like a Clive Barker story and bringing it here into the Marvel Universe for this Werewolf and Ghost Rider story. And considering that this was a code-approved book, the type of horror that was on hand here, and the, I guess you could say, more adult nature or in depiction of some of the content, I thought it was kind of like, whoa, man, that's pretty intense, for a code-approved book. But the story, it kicks off where, the character of Jack Russell is on the trail of the surviving Braineaters who had been, for the most part, nearly wiped out by a fanatical group of werewolf hunters that had also nearly killed Jack Russell back in the story Children of the Beast. And he had initially thought that they'd all been wiped out, but it turns out some of them had survived and had basically been, tearing their way across the country, leaving a trail of mutilated and tortured bodies with their brains devoured, of course. And so, I mean, there's a reason they're called the Braineaters. But they're very sadistic, very cunning, and very cruel. And whereas Jack Russell has made peace with himself as a monster and is able to, not only have the strength and power of the werewolf, but also maintain his human intellect, the Braineaters, they're also able to maintain their intellect as well, but they give in to their monstrous side and are willingly sadistic, towards, their victims. And so, basically, because Jack Russell was in a way responsible for their existence, I mean, he feels it's his responsibility to hunt them down, or I should say, track them down and offer them an ultimatum. Basically, either turn your lives around, make a change for the better, or I'm going to kill you all. And so, considering that he was their quote unquote father, by way of having turned them into werewolves in the first place, I mean, that's pretty brutal, or it's pretty grim. And so, unfortunately, though, the trail ends up in Brooklyn, where Danny Ketch, aka Ghost Rider, has his stomping grounds. And so, one particular night, Ghost Rider comes across some of the bodies of the Braineaters' most recent victims. And so, seeing as how innocent blood has been spilled, and these victims were clearly tortured before they died, Ghost Rider's pissed. And so, with the spilling of innocent blood, Ghost Rider's on the case to find the monsters who did this. And so, it's around this point in time that Jack Russell is following their trail, and it leads to this park in Brooklyn. And at this point in time, there's this little kid named Billy who was initially with a couple of friends of his, and they were messing around in the park at night and doing kid stuff, right? But they hear a bunch of noise and they see a bunch of lights, and Billy's wanting to know what the commotion is. And so while his friends run away, he follows the noise, and he ends up stumbling upon the Braineaters as they're in the process of mutilating and devouring a man and a woman, a couple, as their most recent victims. And so, poor Billy, I mean, he's more than a little shocked and terrified at all this. And unfortunately for him, the Braineaters pick up his scent when the wind shifts. And so they are definitely intending to kill him, since he's, seen their faces. But at the same time, they feel like there's a little too much exposure, because this is, a park in Brooklyn, and there's a lot of people around, and they just happen to be in a secluded, a section of the park at this point in time. And so they decide to, since they have his scent, they'll be able to track him down later. And so they split the scene. But in the meantime, though, Jack Russell stumbles upon, this particular, crime scene, this particular, set of bodies. And, he shifts into his werewolf form, to get a better fix on the situation, i.e., to smell around the crime scene and, see if he can track down the Braineaters and where they're going next. But unfortunately, it's at this point that Ghost Rider comes upon the scene, and he sees this werewolf, crouched over, one of the murder victims, with some of the victim's blood on himself. And Ghost Rider jumps to conclusions, albeit kind of understandably, that this werewolf is the killer. And so the two of them have a knockdown, drag-out fight that initially seems to go both ways, but they end up sort of calling a truce when they realize that there was a witness to this crime, and they find Billy, and they're trying to get him to tell them what was going on. But unfortunately, Billy, I mean, he's already traumatized by what he's seen the Braineaters do, and seeing a walking, talking werewolf and a skull-faced, demonic, figure, trying to get information from him, that just, traumatizes him even more. And so, he runs home only to find that the Braineaters have beaten him to it, before he could get there. And it turns out that they've unfortunately murdered his family. And so, Billy, more than a little traumatized and terrified at this point, hightails it out of the house and, tries to make his way across one of the many bridges, in Brooklyn. And so, unfortunately, though, he's, soon found by the Braineaters. And while, Jack Russell and, Ghost Rider are able to give chase and, fight some of the Braineaters, they're unfortunately outnumbered, and Jack Russell ends up, being pitched into the river, and Ghost Rider is put into a position where he has to surrender to the Braineaters, so they won't kill Billy. And so, they initially try to tear him apart by way of, having some of their, chains, tied to, his limbs, and their motorcycles. And, basically they try and tear him apart by, going, different ways, with the chains attached to him and their motorcycles. But Ghost Rider is a lot stronger than they think, and he basically kind of turns the tables on them and sends them flying, since he refuses to be moved. And, he basically just kind of holds it all in and, pulls them as they're trying to, pull him. And he's a lot stronger than them. But while he does some damage to them, though, unfortunately, they end up, the remainder of them end up kidnapping Billy. And so it's at this point that, Ghost Rider, realizes that, he's needing to team up with someone who's familiar, with, the situation, with these creatures. And so he finds that, Jack Russell's still alive, and, the two of them, once, they both, turn back into their human forms, they make a plan, to try and, find the Braineaters, because, they obviously need to stop their murder spree, but they also need to save Billy. And so, at this point, the Braineaters are, holding him hostage at this, bar that they frequent. And Danny Ketch, as he was told by Jack Russell, decides to go ahead and, try and find out what he can throughout the neighborhood. He's trying to, ask around at, these bars and stuff, because, he's a resident of this area. And so, so whereas if Jack Russell had tried to do it, the Braineaters know him by sight and by smell. But seeing as how, they're unfamiliar with Danny Ketch, if not Ghost Rider, they, Danny Ketch and Jack Russell feel that, Danny has a better chance of finding something out about the Braineaters than Jack Russell does. Like, there's a bit of a, element of surprise in the sense that Danny Ketch is the one going after the Braineaters, because they're not going to expect him to do that, and they're not going to know who he is. And so when he finds the bar that they're holed up at, he's able to, see Billy, and that Billy's being held captive, but he also makes friends with one of their number, a woman named Lupe, who, while she's definitely in it for the thrill, she's not a straight up sadist like the rest of them are, and she actually feels bad about, the fact that they've killed innocent, people. And she says, like, she has no problem with, say, going after like a, full on, grown up redneck or something like that, but, women and children, she feels very conflicted about. And so Danny, when he makes her acquaintance, the two of them strike up a bit of an odd friendship. And, Danny's trying to tell her that, hey, I get the feeling that, you're not fully in on, basically you're not in on this. Like, you want to do better with your life, but, this is all you know. And so, the words really, get to Lupe. And so it's at this point that, the other members of the pack see that she's getting a little too friendly with Danny, and so they take him outside and beat the crap out of him, and to a point where he's in a coma for about a day or so. And Jack Russell, was the one who found him and took him into the sewers to mend his wounds. And the reason that he took him into the sewers is because, with all the, smells of, filth and everything, the Braineaters shouldn't be able to find them there. And so, they decide to come up with another plan, to not only save Billy, but to defeat the Braineaters. And what they end up doing is, getting some silver bullets and binding them to, Ghost Rider's chain links. And so, when the, Braineaters, face off with Danny Ketch and, Jack Russell again, in their monstrous forms, mind you, in their, monstrous alter egos, this trap is sprung. And so, whereas earlier, Ghost Rider had tried to use his, chain links on them, like he'd been able to do some physical damage, but nothing lasting, because silver is the only thing that really works on a werewolf. But this time, though, with the silver bullets being, basically, welded to the chain links, they now have, these silver bullets in their bodies, to a point where, as Jack Russell tells them, if they try to, turn into, a werewolf, like a full-on werewolf, the silver will kick in and will basically, poison them. And so some of them call Jack's bluff, and unfortunately for them, end up dying on the spot. But some of them, though, they're like, oh crap, I've got the silver in me, but I mean, I still got a chance here. If I don't, all I got to do is not turn into a werewolf. And so, so some of them, they kind of, go on the run, trying to stay human for as long as they can, and maybe try and find some way to, get the silver bullets out of them. But since they're werewolves, I mean, it's probably not going to be as easy as that, because of, I guess, the way, their curse works and what have you. But the ringleader of the Braineaters is captured by Ghost Rider, and whereas Ghost Rider is basically refusing to, let him die, like he's refusing to kill him, but he's also, refusing to let him die by way of poisoning, so that way he can face his punishment. This ringleader basically wiggles his way out of Ghost Rider's grasp and willingly falls to his death on a spiked fence below and commits suicide, because in his words, he's basically, if he can't turn into a wolf again, or a werewolf again, then, what's the point of, living? Because as a werewolf, he could really experience, the night as, it was in all its primal glory. But as a human, though, he can't. And so, that's why he ends up committing suicide. And so the good news is, the threat of the Braineaters has ended for the time being. I mean, there are a couple of them that managed to escape, but they've got silver in their bodies, and so they won't be able to transform into werewolves. And also, they're able to rescue Billy, but the bad news is, psychologically, the poor kid's very shaken up, and it's going to take some time for him to recover from the trauma of what he's been through, and what he's seen, and the fact that he walked in on his, family having been killed. But also, the woman Lupe was murdered by, her own gang for not only, I guess you could say, trying to turn over a new leaf, courtesy of Danny's conversation with her, but also, trying to save Billy and get him out of, the hands of the Braineaters. And so, you have a woman who was trying to, do good, after a life of, horror and carnage, she ends up, basically paying the price for redemption, as it were. But, the story ends, though, with Jack Russell and Danny Ketch, saying their goodbyes and acknowledging that the two of them actually have a bit of a bit more in common with each other than they thought, in a sense that they both have to, struggle with their demons and, try and find a balance, in the sense that, no one side can be fully in control. Like, it has to go both ways. And so, they basically part as friends, and, that's how the story ends. But I thought that this was actually a pretty good story. And I thought that, as a work of horror, it was a good follow-up to Children of the Beast. And I thought that a lot of the darker elements were very well done. And it definitely, reminded you, the reader, that, yeah, you're reading a horror story here. Because the Braineaters, not only do they look terrifying, but through their actions were terrifying. I mean, these were, monsters who thrived on bloodshed and mayhem, and, loved to torture their victims before ultimately killing them. And some aspects of their characters, sort of, touched upon, I guess you could say, darker themes of sexuality, and a sense of how Lupe interacted with some of the members of the pack, and vice versa. And it was at those points that I felt like Chris Cooper was, taking a cue from some of the works of Clive Barker, in the sense that there was something, terrifying and yet erotic about these, interactions. And so the fact that this was kind of in a code-approved book, this sort of flirtation with, I guess you could say adult horror, was kind of a surprise, but was pretty well done. And I also liked how, amidst the horror of it all, I mean, the character of Lupe, in her brief interaction with Danny, was shown to be someone who wasn't entirely evil, and ended up wanting, some form of redemption. And sadly, though, said redemption ended up costing her her life. But she did try to save Billy, though, because she recognized that, he was innocent, and, there was, nothing to be gained from torturing an innocent, even though she no doubt participated in, the group's activities prior to this. But I also liked how the initial fight, with the whole mistaken identity, was a common trope, but in this particular case, it made sense because you had two monstrous characters, who were both, evil looking to each other, mixing it up because of this, and also just because of circumstantial evidence. But at the end of the day, once they realized what was really going on, they were able to put their differences aside and actually work together, and ultimately ended up becoming friends. And excuse me. And so the fact that both of these characters, their human alter egos, were constantly having to, maintain this balancing act, with their darker sides, their literal inner demons, as it were, was something that, resulted in some interesting and memorable interactions between the two of them. And so when they part ways as friends, it was something that felt believable, and it also felt earned. And so I'm pretty sure that Werewolf and Ghost Rider, cross paths again in the future, at this point in the 90s. But this was their first interaction with one another, and I thought that, all things considered, it was a good, first meeting, as it were. Now, I do think that there are some moments where, while I like the artwork of John Stanisci, I do think that there were some instances where he kind of struggled with scene transition, because there are moments where certain events happen that it looks like, 1 minute the characters are in one space, and then in the next panel they're suddenly way over there, that kind of thing. And I think that maybe, if he had been able to, I guess you could say, work with the script in such a way to where the transitions made a little more sense, I think that some of the initial awkwardness, especially with the first chapter, would have been avoided altogether. And I also think that while I did like Chris Cooper's idea of having Jack, use silver bullets along with Ghost Rider's chain links to defeat the Braineaters, I did think there was kind of a missed opportunity for, say, having Ghost Rider use his penance stare on the Braineaters, because no doubt they've caused a lot of pain and misery to those around them. And so, the idea of Ghost Rider, using his penance stare on such characters, I mean, I would have loved to have seen that, especially, since these are literally monsters, as opposed to, say, just ordinary human criminals. But unfortunately, we didn't get to see that. But on the other hand, though, I liked how Chris Cooper handled Ghost Rider's internal thought process, because it was consistent with Howard Mackey's portrayal of Ghost Rider in his own book at this point in time. Because Ghost Rider was at this point struggling with the fact that, I mean, yes, he's a spirit of vengeance, and he's trying to get vengeance for those who have been harmed or murdered by those who are evil, but he's conflicted about the fact that he can only act after innocent blood has been spilled. Like, he can't like Danny Ketch can't turn into Ghost Rider, prior to that happening. And so, unfortunately, both Ghost Rider and Danny Ketch, are in a position where they literally have to wait for, someone to be hurt or killed before they can act, before Danny Ketch can turn into Ghost Rider. And so, the way Chris Cooper handled this, I thought, was very consistent with, how Howard Mackey depicted this, such situations in his own book, as well as, other stories here in Marvel Comics Presents, and also how, other writers had portrayed, the character at this point throughout other books. But I think that Chris Cooper did a good job of keeping things consistent overall. I do think, though, that while I like the character of Lupe, I think her, I guess you could say, moral change, came a little too quickly. Now, granted, I realized that this being an anthology comic, and each chapter of a story is only 8 pages long, I understand that there was only so much room with which the creative team could work. But I just felt like, while I liked her character, and ultimately, her, death actually was a sad moment. Both just the fact that, the nature of her character and how well she was written overall, and the fact, that Danny literally has her die in his arms. I mean, it's like, I thought that she was a good character, and her death was sad, and it was handled well to where there was an emotional impact for not only the reader, but for the characters in the book. I did think that it would have been more, I think that they could have done a better job of, I guess you could say, maybe going a little bit into her background some more, and figuring out, like, how did she get to this point, and maybe showing that she'd always been struggling with, say, on one hand, giving into her feral nature, but also trying to maintain a sense of morality. It would have just been nice, I thought, if we'd gotten a little bit more of that, as opposed to, say, just drawing our own conclusions as far as, what we see on page, and, the brief amount of dialogue that we get with her and Danny Ketch interacting with one another. So, as much as I liked her character, I just think that it would have been better had we seen, how she got to where she was, if that makes sense. And also, while I do appreciate the fact that they had it to where Jack Russell and Danny Ketch, were talking about Billy and confirming that yes, Billy's okay now, because authorities were able to take him away, to where he was going to be monitored at a hospital. I mean, I think it would have been a nice touch of, say, much like the prior story, Doorway to Darkness, wherein Ghost Rider and Doctor Strange were able to be on hand visibly, for the child character in that book until authorities came. I think that if we'd had a similar moment in Return of the Braineaters for the character of Billy, I think that that would have been a more, I guess you could say, somber conclusion for the book, because you get some lines of dialogue that confirm that yes, Billy's being taken to a hospital, and I mean, and physically he's okay, but mentally it's going to be a while before he's good upstairs. But it would have been nice if we'd actually gotten to see that moment as opposed to, say, just having it talked about in dialogue. But overall, though, I think that this was a good story. You had a very terrifying threat in the form of the Braineaters, and these were monsters. I mean, this this group of this group of monsters were very sadistic and very terrifying, and they reminded you that yes, you were reading a horror story. And so you got a lot of mileage out of them. And also, liked seeing, Jack Russell and Danny Ketch, and the fact that they saw a lot of themselves with the Braineaters, in a sense that, this is what could happen if they, go off the reservation altogether, so to speak. But in working together, they saw that, there was a chance and there was hope for them, in a sense that, they could still get a handle on things. So I'm going to go ahead and give Return of the Beast 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good story. And as I mentioned earlier, not quite as good as Children of the Beast, but still a well-done sequel overall. But real quick, I'll go ahead and show y'all some of the artwork here. First, the cover art. Here's 107. You got some really good Sam Keith artwork here. (108). Another good Sam Keith cover. (109). (110). 111. And last but not least, 112. So I'll show you some of the interior art just real quick here, because the Sam Keith artwork on the covers is very well done, but the interior art by John Stanisci is something else entirely. It's a different beast altogether. I know these are, the Braineaters are werewolves, but, with the lighting right here, they kind of look like vampires, but they still look pretty spooky in their human form. And here's Billy. While his friends are going home, he's, wanting to stay and figure out what's going on. And lo and behold, a rather nasty crime scene being committed. pretty disturbing stuff right here. And yeah, I mean, Billy's definitely going to be traumatized by all this. And here's, Ghost Rider, walking, basically stumbling upon, Jack Russell, in turn stumbling upon the crime scene. And, here's where you get the mistaken identity fight. And I liked how Stanisci, had his depiction of the werewolf be consistent with how the werewolf looked in the pages of the other stories that he was in Marvel Comics Presents. So good points for consistency. And here they are fighting each other. And so I liked how you see that, basically both Ghost Rider and the werewolf did some damage to each other. And I mean, I guess if I wanted to nitpick, I could, ask, why was, the werewolf able to, do as much damage to Ghost Rider as he was. But then, when you read the Children of the Beast story, you realize that there's a lot more of a deeper connection to, say, the supernatural side of things, with, Jack Russell specifically. And so, supernatural is able to, match supernatural, maybe. So, that could be, a reason as to why the two of them were able to go back and forth with one another. And here you are, a rather, terrifying scene where they are interrogating and then murdering Billy's family. And there's Lupe right there. And this is where I feel like, you get the sort of, Clive Barker, level of dark eroticism here with her character. And a sort of a masochistic relationship that she has with some of the members of her pack. I love this shot right here. This is after Ghost Rider's turned back into Danny Ketch. And here's Jack, finding him. So yeah, I like how even though, Jack Russell's a good guy, I mean, as a werewolf, I mean, he still looks like a monster. So I thought that was pretty cool. Because some artists, they, if a monster is a good guy, they try and make, said monster look cute, but no, they still make him look like a monster. And I kind of like the artwork right here, with the flashback. And I mean, it kind of makes me think of something that Bill Stekovich would do. Here's something you don't see every day. Werewolves on motorcycles. And here's where they force Ghost Rider to surrender. And once again, I mean, I think Stanisci did a good job on, making the Braineaters look terrifying. I like this part though, where they're trying to rip him apart with the chains, and Ghost Rider just basically holds it all in and then causes them to go for a fall, by breaking their chains apart. And here's Danny, going along with Jack's plan to try and, find the Braineaters. And then he finds them, and Lupe, doing her thing at the bar. And I liked how, like, say right here, even though the Braineaters are in their human forms at this point, they can still tap into their monstrous side to sort of, have, like, animal-like teeth and what have you. So yeah, once again we get this Clive Barker level of dark eroticism here. I thought that Chris Cooper, both in writing and Stanisci in terms of artwork, did a nice job in handling the dark eroticism of the scene. I mean, just look at that. Very seductive. And here they are, getting jealous of her, making eyes with Danny, or Danny making eyes with her, And yeah, they just beat the crap out of the poor kid. And welcome to Danny's nightmare. Not a nice way to wake up, even if, this is a good guy here. But, imagine it's like, Danny's having a nightmare, and then he wakes up, and that's the first thing he sees. But... so this is where Lupe, unfortunately meets her end. She gets the kid out of there, or tries to get the kid out of there. Yeah. And then she dies in Danny's arms, and yeah, Danny's pissed, and so is Ghost Rider in turn. But I like this little detail, though. I mean, after, she's basically just been shredded and everything, it's like you see that she's weeping blood. That's pretty dark. So, here we are. I love this page right here. It's just a really good picture of Ghost Rider. And here we are. The silver bullets fused to the chain links. There you go. The Braineaters get a taste of their own sadistic mess. And there's the leader, willingly falling to his death. And I like how, you have this bit where, with the shading and everything, it kind of looks like, Ghost Rider is, if not mourning the leader's death, he's mourning the fact that, the leader's escaping justice. Just the way the shading on his skull is, it looks like, his eyes are closing. Here they are in the cemetery, parting ways, Danny Ketch and Jack But yeah, so that was Return of the Braineaters. It was a pretty good little horror story, and it was a worthy sequel to the Children of the Beast storyline. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to subscribe. So y'all take care, have a good night, bye.